Welcome all you future educators, current educators, and lifelong learners to another video where we take technology, teaching strategies, and emerging trends to create engaging educational experiences. In this video, Jeremiah is in the middle of a design project and is looking for media to help make that final product a little bit more exciting. Specifically, he is searching Google Images and he's found just the right picture to use in this portion of the lesson. He clicks on it, ready to save it, but then he sees it. Images may be subject to copyright. At first, he blows off the message, but then again, he doesn't want the client to face any copyright problems down the road. Plus, he would probably be liable for using the image in the first place. Is it worth the risk? How does he even know if the work is copyrighted? Well, before grabbing that image, let's work with Jeremiah through some of the basics of copyright law and deciding whether or not a piece of media will be okay to use. So to start out, let's just get out of the way some legalese and common sense. Realize that we are not copyright lawyers, so we don't know the ins and outs of all copyright law. We're instructional designers. Our knowledge of copyright law is based on needing to find resources to use in our classes and trainings. Thus, we have a very base level of the requirements needed for determining whether or not you can use that awesome image or song that you found. If you want detailed information about the ins or outs, or if you need legal advice because you found yourself in some kind of infringement case, this is not the video for you. But if you're wondering whether or not you can use that piece of media you found, or whether or not the copyright says don't use it, then this is where we're going to try and guide you. Now, when looking at copyright law, one thing to remember is that it is a very gray area. There are some stringent laws about it, but a lot of it's based on case law and having a judge make a determination of whether or not you broke copyright. You'll probably hear things like you can only use 10% or so many words or something like that, but those are just guidelines that various organizations have made. In the end, it comes down to you and a plaintiff arguing in front of a judge and the judge making the call. So when talking about some of this, you gotta realize that it's really iffy stuff. Also, realize that most of the time, if you are breaking copyright law, they'll usually send you a notice to fix it rather than just slapping you with an immediate lawsuit. So if you get one of those notices, take care of it, don't do it again, and usually you'll be fine. Now with that being said, what can I use? Well, generally there are 4 routes that you can go to see whether or not a work can be used for what you need. You can go with licensing, Creative Commons, public domain, and fair use. The easiest to start with is licensing or getting permission. If in doubt, you can always ask the copyright owner for permission to use the work. However, a lot of times that's really hard to find. Another way to make sure that you're covered is by buying a license. However, when purchasing the license to use a work, you want to be sure to double check some of the fine print. If you intend to manipulate the item in any way, say crop out the picture or change the color or the brightness of an image, you need to make sure that you're allowed to do that. For example, when searching on iStock for stock photos, I can quickly navigate around their site and find out here that I can basically modify the image and do whatever I want once I've bought the license. Now, purchasing stock images are a good way to avoid copyright problems, but they can be pretty costly, and people may end up purchasing a license to the same material you did, so your stuff may be seen on other sites or other videos too. So just be aware of that if you're going to go and purchase a license on some of these. Now, if you don't have the funds to purchase a license for stock images, you can search for some free ones under what is called the Creative Commons licenses. Creative Commons is basically where users that create media can put their own licenses on their works for community use. Now, there are a mix of options that can be used, but they fall under the categories of attribution, which means you need to give credit to the author of the work, share alike, which means you can change the image, but you have to share it under the same Creative Commons licensing as the original image. No derivatives, which means you cannot change that work at all. And non-commercial, which means that you can use the work in any way you want as long as it's not for a business purpose. These 4 options can be mixed and matched to allow the owner of the work to be very specific in how they want to let the community use it. So how do we find these? Usually, you can look for a search option in the search bar on image sites that'll allow you to filter down to Creative Commons licenses. Also, there's a lot of websites out there like Unsplash that will tell you all images on their site are under a certain license. Now, if we go to Flickr, we can search for a house and then turn on the filter to see exactly what Creative Commons licenses we want to use. Then, when we look at the image we want, we can see in this case that the no derivatives identifier is missing because we filtered all of those items out because we wanted to be able to modify this. So thus, as long as we follow what the creator of the work has said we could do with their image, we are good to go using it. Now, outside of licensing and Creative Commons, public domain items are thought to belong to the good of society in general, and thus they come with no copyright restrictions on them. How does something get into the public domain though? Well, this is where copyright law starts getting a little bit more blurry. You may have to do some digging, but in general, if the work was published before 1927, it's in the public domain. After that, it has to either go 70 years from the author's death or 120 years from the creation or publishing of a work if the author is anonymous, and then it enters into the public domain. That means if an author died in 1972, then his or her works would enter into the public domain in 2042. If an article was published anonymously in 1972, it would be 2092 before it would enter the public domain. Now, there are a few items that don't fit nicely into those categories, but for those cases, you'd have to look up the original work. That is one reason why old classical music is oftentimes used in videos, because most of those authors died a long time ago. Now lastly, any work produced by the government automatically falls into the public domain because your tax dollars paid for it. Your last option to look at for using a work is fair use. Now, fair use is the grayest of all realms within copyright. Fair use is judged on a case-by-case basis and weighs 4 different things at the same time: the purpose that you're going to use it for, the nature of the work that was copyrighted, the amount of the work that you intend to use, and the impact of market value on the original work. Now, for the purpose you're using it for, you need to make sure that you are creating a new idea or expression. Additionally, there are certain fields that are generally looked at more favorably for fair use, including things like journalism, education, and criticisms. Creating something for a business purpose is a little bit harder to argue fair use on. When looking at the nature of the copyrighted work, look at whether or not it is a factual work like a technical document, or is it a highly creative work like a novel. Generally speaking, factual works are looked at as a little bit more favorable to use fair use against. For the amount of work used, you can't just literally look at how much you used, but you also have to look at whether or not it is the most important piece of that work that you used. Those two factors play together to determine how much you can truly use and still be considered fair use. Lastly, you have to look at whether or not your use will negatively impact the marketability of the original work. So for example, if you use an entire major battle of a movie or something, would a judge be able to determine that audiences wouldn't go see the movie because you just showed them the best part? The tricky part is that another judge might actually say it increased its marketability because now people will be more excited since they saw that, kind of like watching a movie trailer. That's why fair use gets so tricky. It is very subjective. Now in the description below, I'll go ahead and post a link to the US Copyrights YouTube channel, as they've got some good published materials on fair use and public domain and some other aspects of copyright. I don't feel like you'll get a clear 20/20 vision out of it, but maybe hearing it from the actual source will help too. But what about Jeremiah's photo? Is he allowed to use the image? Well, again, it depends. First, since a license wasn't purchased, we need to go and look and see if there's some kind of Creative Commons license associated with it. If we can't find anything, we have to assume that it doesn't have any, so then we have to start doing some digging in the public domain. Now, chances are it isn't old enough, but without knowing for sure, we have to assume that it isn't old enough. It's probably not in the public domain. Thus, we finally fall back on fair use. The question is whether or not the 4 factors together would count to say that it's fair use. For an image, that's a lot harder to sell since you're going to be using the full-blown image in most things that you do. Thus, we'd go ahead and recommend refining the search filters and looking a little bit longer for that perfect image that we know has a Creative Commons license associated with it. Now, copyright law is definitely a tricky ground to navigate, so trying to build up as many resources as we can that use Creative Commons is helpful. So do you guys know of any other sites that allow Creative Commons searches other than Google Images or Flickr? Do you know of any other sites that have total Creative Commons licensing on their materials, such as Unsplash or Pixabay? Let us know your thoughts and other resources down in the comments below, and that way we can all start making those videos and lessons look just a little bit sweeter. Also, if you like content like this where we're talking about enhancing your classes, using technology and teaching strategies, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and we'll try to get new content out there to help you guys make those educational experiences just a little bit better. In the meantime, good luck, keep building, and we look forward to seeing what you guys create.